This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends in Oklahoma City. The date is October 29th, 1970. I'm visiting with Mr. H.B., that's H.B. Heine Bass from Enid, Oklahoma, a longtime construction man in Enid, whose father was farmed the D.C. Bass and Son Construction Company. Um, we will talk with Mr. Bass about construction. We will also talk about Enid, about Oklahoma in general, and other areas in which he is involved. Mr. Bass has been particularly interested in history and has been a longtime member of the board of directors of the Oklahoma Historical Society. He has written considerably. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Oklahoma Living Legends. Um, Mr. Bass, I'd like to start by asking you to give your personal family background, the names of your parents, where your parents were born, and to begin with, let's talk about where they were born, what they did before they came to Oklahoma, and then your father moving into Oklahoma. Uh, you can talk just as long as it takes to do that particular thing. In other words, we're not concerned about time or about having to get a new question. If you want to move from one thing into another, that's fine.
All right, I can talk long enough. My father was born in Ontario, Canada. His parents emigrated from Germany just prior to the Civil War, intending to settle in the western United States, but they became so concerned about the conditions in the United States that in the late 50s that they decided to go to Canada first. So as soon as the Civil War ended, they emigrated to western Nebraska when my father was 1 year old. He grew up in Cumming County, Nebraska, learned the carpenter trade, and when he learned of the Cherokee Strip opening, he journeyed to Oklahoma City, had spent several weeks building wooden sidewalks on California and Reno streets in Oklahoma City. Uh, my mother was
just prior to the Cherokee Strip?
just prior, just a few days before. My mother was born in near Peoria, Illinois, and her father was his. Her mother passed away, and her father brought herself and four brothers to Cumming County, Nebraska. That's where my father and mother met, and they came to Oklahoma together to make the run into the Cherokee Strip. Uh, my father saved enough money working in Oklahoma City to build buy a very fast Indian pony. And on that pony, he rode into the Cherokee Strip at high noon on September the 16th, 1893. The old cottonwood tree standing on Highway number 81 on the Kingfisher Garfield County line marks the exact spot from where my father started running the Cherokee Strip. He pointed that tree out to me many times.
Did he have any description of the Cherokee Strip run or any recollections that might be worth putting on tape?
Well, I don't know if it did or not, but my father rode this pony into the strip and got a claim right north of Walcomas. But my Uncle Charles, with his wife and two children, and my mother and her two older children, followed him in a covered wagon. By the time they reached and found my father on the claim that he had staked, my mother was so ill they decided they'd better come on into Enid looking for a doctor. So they continued right on into Enid and met Dr. H.B. McKenzie, a doctor who had come up from on the train from Texas. And Dr. McKenzie nursed my mother through a very severe case of typhoid fever. Of course, my father, being a carpenter, immediately collected together enough boards and built a one-story house. And I often heard my mother say when I was in my younger days that she was the envy of all the women in the neighborhood because all the rest of them passed most of the first winter in tents. Well, she actually had a house to live in, even though it was just a room wooden house.
Were they in the sod house at any period?
No, they were never in a sod house. But they continued on. My father immediately began contracting, and since he was an awfully good carpenter journeyman, he had little difficulty in getting plenty of work, and he just continued on contracting from then on. One very interesting episode in his, you might call it construction life, was he took the contract to build a coffin and bury Dick Yeager, who was probably Oklahoma's outstanding early day bandit. He was finally surrounded in a cornfield near Hennessy and shot and mortally wounded. They brought him to the Garfield County jail, and after he passed away, my father built the coffin and buried him in a potter's field. But a very interesting episode happened. We had an editor named J.L. Eisenberg who wrote an interesting story about my father and the funeral procession, which consisted of my father in a springboard wagon and a little yellow dog, my older brother and sister's dog, following the coffin to the grave. Eisenberg put this on Associated Press, and that was probably the most publicized construction project the Enid, the Bass Construction Company, has ever had. Well, my father continued on, and in 1900 he received a contract to build the first brick schoolhouse in Enid.
Did you, speaking of the funeral, were you there, or was it before?
No, that occurred 2 years before I was born.
Go ahead, let's go.
Yeah. Well, my father built the first brick schoolhouse in Enid, and we have continued building schoolhouses ever since. I think we have had over 25 school construction contracts in Enid. He built the first 3 brick schoolhouses built in Enid. And then my father was one of the original organizers of the Methodist Church in Enid. And shortly after this church was organized, the congregation gathered a few dollars together and bought a lot on North Grand in Enid, and on that my father constructed the first Methodist church, and in fact the first church building built in Enid. The congregation worshiped there until 1909, at which time my father built a brick church building on West Randolph, Enid. This was at the time much the most pretentious place of worship in the Cherokee Strip. The congregation had a terribly hard time ever getting that building paid for, but they finally did. And then in 1960, our construction company built the present sanctuary for the Methodists, and in 1966 we built the educational building, which gives our Methodist Church in Enid a very fine plant.
Could you tell us a little about some of the problems involved with construction then that are different from those that are involved now?
I'll say I can. You know, in the early days when I started working with my father, my first recollection was carrying in the construction, it was carrying drinking water to the men on the job of the Methodist Church we were building in 1909. At that time, there was no concrete mixers. All concrete was mixed on a wooden platform by hand, which is probably the hardest work ever devised. There was no mechanical hoists, so we always had a hoist mule, or a horse if we couldn't get a mule, to pull the wheelbars loaded with concrete and brick and mortar. There were no power saws. I'll never, in building the Methodist Church, my father had a great deal of difficulty in collecting the final payments, since we, along in about 1911, Enid went into a very severe recession. In settling with the church, he took over the original church site on North Grand Avenue, and he had a terrible time paying that, but thanks to a lenient banker named H.H. Champlin, who later founded the Champlin Refining Company, my father finally got it paid for. In 1912, 3 Enid gentlemen obtained the Ford automobile agency, Mr. B.M. Athey, Mr. Ed Pendleton, and Mr. F.J. Gentry. They entered into a contract with my father to lease a building from him on this old Methodist church site. So my dad built, that was the first garage building built in Enid. And I'll never forget, my older brother and I turned practically all the concrete for the foundation of that building by hand on a wooden platform. Just as the time came to pour the concrete floors, a cement finisher in the name of Charlie Pelton came along with a little one-cylinder revolving concrete mixer, the first one that ever came to Enid. And believe me, I have blessed that gentleman ever since, because it stopped that back-breaking, turn the concrete with a shovel on a wooden platform.
What about brick?
Well, of course, one thing about a brick, Enid had a brick supply always in the last few years. A gentleman named Edmund France came to Enid, and Mr. France was really a wonderful city builder. He was he was a brother of Frank France, the last territorial governor, and he was instrumental in bringing both the Frisco and Santa Fe railroads to Enid. And along with his other activities, he started making brick at a plant southeast of Enid, a plant which operated until just about 4 years ago. It was sold out to the Acme Brick Company, and they dismantled the plant.
What about the structure, the steel structure then compared with now?
Well, of course, in the early days we had practically no steel structures. It was all brick walls and wood joists or wood trusses. Actually, and this is I think a very interesting Oklahoma historical incident. The first really major structural steel job in Enid was the Methodist church my father built in 1909. J.B. Klein had come to Oklahoma City, and his descendants claim he never was in the junk business, but I happen to know he was, because I heard Mr. Klein's story too many times. He was more or less in the, maybe we should say, used metal. I think some of his descendants are still put out, maybe because they called their father and grandfather a junk dealer. Anyway, Mr. Klein learned of this Methodist church job in Enid and decided it'd be a fine time to go in the structural business, steel business. So he came to Enid and sold my father on the idea of letting him handle a steel business. Formerly, all our steel had come from Wichita, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. That was the first real structural steel job that the J.B. Klein Iron Foundry Company, which is now the Robertson Steel Company, ever turned out. And actually, I've got Mr. Klein's word that the Methodist Church in Enid in 1909 put him in the steel business, which of course, as practically everybody in Oklahoma knows, is now a very important industrial plant in Oklahoma City.
What can you tell us about some of your other earlier buildings?
Well, of course, that was the church was 1909. The Gentry Garage building was 1912. In 1913, my father built a very fine bank building for the Enid Bank and Trust Company. For O.J. Fleming was the original Enid banker, was the president principal stockholder. And then we I don't know how early it'd be, but there's 2 or 3 interesting projects we've had. We built the original Halliburton Oil Well Cementing Company office building in Duncan, and that was the first building built in Oklahoma with a complete air conditioning plant in it. Back in 1930, we built the 11-story Bass building, and it's an interesting fact that in 1930 I could find no engineer in the United States who could tell us how to design that building in preparation for future air conditioning. By 1930 we knew air conditioning was coming, but so little knowledge of the actual process of conditioned air was known that no one could tell us how to design that building for it. In 1936 we started a project of which I'm still not proud. The Cherokee Terrace Housing Project in Enid is the first public housing project ever built in the United States. It was a sort of an interesting thing, and I blame my across the street neighbor Harry France for it. Harry decided to build a new home. We had an architect in Enid named George Blumenauer. Like everybody in the construction business in those days was on the verge of starvation. Harry paid this architect $1,000 for drawing the plans for his new house. This gentleman used the money to buy a new Ford and drive to Washington, where Harold Ickes was dreaming up public housing. He talked Harold Ickes into including Enid as a 46th city in the United States to experiment with public housing. Mr. Blumenauer got the commission, hurried back to Enid, got the foundation plans finished as rapidly as he could so that he could get some money on his commission. They took bids on just the foundation of the Cherokee Terrace housing project, and that, from all the records we can discover, is the first public housing project contract ever let. And later on, after we got the foundation in, we received the contract for the superstructure. And that's enough about public housing because, oh, very much so. And it really is. They were well built, brick walls with reinforced concrete floors, and it's in splendid. It's one public housing project which has been maintained. So many of them are in more or less slum areas where they're just are allowed to fall apart, but not this one.
It's still operating.
Oh, very much. And it's 182 units, and it's full right now. And if there's such a thing as a successful public housing project, I would say it is the one. Now, I can talk an awful lot about interesting construction projects we have. Now, one maybe I should detail a little bit is Mr. H.H. Champlin's house. It seems kind of odd for me to say, being from a town as small as Enid, to say that the finest house ever built by anybody anywhere stands in Enid, Oklahoma, but I still make that statement, and I have looked at fine homes all over the world, and I still have never found a house in quality equal to the Champlin house in Enid, Oklahoma. Mr. Champlin spent 25 years planning this house. He started when he was at the age of 70. We had an architect in Enid named Roy Shaw, who spent all these years working on his house. From the time I entered the construction business, I'd heard about the Champlin house, and no one, including the architect, ever thought it would be built. But one day, Mr. Shaw told me, if you want to have a hand in building the finest house you ever heard of, you better go talk to Mr. Champlin. So I went up to see Mr. Champlin, and we discussed his house. And a short time before, his two daughters and her husband had built very fine homes north of Enid. And Mr. Champlin told me on the basis of what those two houses cost, he felt his house was going to cost $125,000. Well, this was back in 1937 while the Depression was still on, so that sounded like enough money for any house. We discussed the ways it ought to be built, and he announced he was going to take bids on the house. That ended the interview, and I never saw Mr. Champlin for some few weeks. One cold night in February, the telephone rang at 11 o'clock. It was Mr. Champlin. He says, you know, I planned to take bids on my house, but I'm decided to take a trip to California. We're leaving at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I want somebody to be working on that house while I'm gone. How about you go build that house for me? Of course, that was like manna from heaven, and I told him I'd be glad to. Then I asked him, well, where are you going to build this house? I had heard that he was going to build it on a farm he owned across from his daughter's homes out in the country. And then I also knew he'd bought another site in what we call the Kidner Edition, Enid. And Mr. Champlin said, well, you go see Mr. Shaw in the morning. He'll show you where this is going to be built and all about it. So the next morning, I got my number one superintendent, and we got the city engineer and the architect, and we went out the site there in Enid to begin staking out this house. Well, while the rest, I had never looked at the plans, and while the rest of them were searching for corner stakes for this, well, several lots, as a matter of fact, the home's built on, I sat down the running board of the car. At that time, a car still had running boards, and began looking at these plans. Well, one glance told me that he was not going to build that house for $125,000, and I became quite concerned. Here was a man 70 years old starting out on building a house that would cost at least twice what he thought it was going to cost. So I immediately drove downtown and called his son and daughter down and asked them to come down and have a cup of coffee with me. I told them about this house, and I said, now listen, you folks, your dad talked to me about a $125,000 house. Now, I'm telling you right now, he's not going to build this house for only $250,000. Well, they didn't know what to do about it, so finally Joe Chapman said the only suggestion I got is go ahead and handle this just like it was your own. Go ahead with it. So we started in, and no builder could possibly have a more interesting and satisfying experience than that house was, because Mr. Champlin insisted on putting absolutely the best material in every item, whether it was visible or concealed. There was every item in that house was the best that we could buy, and the best anybody knew anything about anywhere in 1938. One very interesting detail of it, and one which caused me to maintain the claim it's the best house ever built, is that all the pipe and all the air ducts were copper. So ever since, when I talk to architecture builders around the world and brag about that house, and they question it, I said, all right, I said, name me one other house you know anywhere in the world where all the air ducts are copper. That always ends the argument. Very interesting. Of course, I could talk all day on that house, but a very interesting item is the story of Oklahoma and the Cherokee. That I cannot answer, but there's 72 thermostats in it. So anyway, the sunroom is the windows are art glass, and the history of the Cherokee Strip is worked out in art glass. It's really one of the greatest pieces of art I've ever seen. Mr. Champlin passed away in 1946. His wife lived to be past 90, but after his death, his son Joe and his wife and children moved in. Now Mrs. Champlin passed away, and just within this calendar year, Joe Champlin passed away, and Joe's widow is living in this wonderful home all by herself. I have not heard any plans she might have of doing otherwise. But do you want me to keep on? Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to detail another interesting construction project that lasted for 18 years. In 1930, we bid on a job at Bartlesville, and on my way home, I drove through Ponca City, and driving by the Continental Oil Company office buildings, I thought of a friend whom I hadn't seen for a year or two, named Harry Moreland. Just a few months before, Dan Moran had come out from New York to take over the affairs of the bankrupt Marlin Oil Company and rebuild it into the Continental Oil Company, which we all know now is a tremendously successful business enterprise. The last I knew of Harry Moreland, he was a clerk in the pipeline department. So I parked my car and walked into the building and went up to the second floor where Mr. Moreland had always officed when I'd visited him, and in the pipeline department, and I didn't see any Mr. Moreland. So I asked somebody where Harry Moreland was, and this boy said, well, Mr. Moreland is now up on the 6th floor. So I took the elevator up to the 6th floor and left the elevator, and right in front of me stood a young man behind the desk, and I told this young man I was looking for Harry Moreland. He says, do you have an appointment with Mr. Moreland? And I said, my land, do you have to have an appointment to see that gentleman these days? Well, this young man said Mr. Moreland's awfully busy. But if you'll give me your card, I will take it in and see if he could possibly have time to see you. Well, I did not have a card, so this boy said, well, give me your name and I'll see if Mr. Moreland can see you. So I gave him my name, and he immediately reappeared and said, Mr. Moreland will see you. I walked in, and here sat Harry Moreland behind E.W. Marlin's magnificent hand-carved desk in Mr. Marlin's office. As we all know, Mr. Marlin was a good spender and went first class and everything in his magnificent paneled office. I said, Harry, what in the world is going on here anyway? And Mr. Moreland says, you know, this is the strangest coincidence. I was just thinking about you when this boy told me you were out here waiting to see me. He says, I am now Vice President and General Manager of the Great Lakes Pipeline Company. It was just organized yesterday, and I thought you might be interested in building some pump stations and terminals for us. He called in Frank Richardson, who was their chief engineer. At that moment, the Great Lakes Pipeline Company only had 2 employees, Harry Moreland, Vice President and General Manager, and Frank Richardson, chief engineer. That has caused me through all the years to contend that I'm the 3rd oldest employee of the Great Lakes Pipeline Company. This pipeline was a dream of Dan Moran's to pump gasoline through a pipeline that had never been done before as a common carrier. So 8 big oil companies went together with Mr. Moran's Continental Oil Company, and they built the Great Lakes Pipeline Company, which continues to serve all the Middle West. And it was, for many years, the largest handler of gasoline in the world. We worked for that company every year for 18 years. And in 1945, I met Mr. Moreland one day, and he says, I want you to get ready, because as soon as Japan is defeated, we are going to start a tremendous expansion program, and we want to start the instant the government the war is over and the government will let us. And we feel that Japan will be defeated in April 1946, and we're drawing our plans and ordering our pipe and everything else in preparation for starting this program in April 1946. Well, when Mr. Moreland's secretary walked in August 1945 and told him that the radio had just flashed that Japan had surrendered, Mr. Moreland never hesitated. He called in his entire staff, told his chief engineer to get every pipeline contract in the United States up there immediately to let contracts for the pipe work. He ordered his purchasing agent to order all the pipe rolling, and he called me personally to get up there as fast as I could. And we started in one of the most fantastic construction programs probably any builder ever undertook. Before we got through with that expansion program, we worked in the states of Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois in 45 different cities. Of course, in August 1945, Wade's and our controls were still on, and the War Production Board had control of everything. So we and labor was practically impossible to get, but we knew that we were going to have to be able to handle gasoline at every pump station and terminal when the pipeline was finished, or it'd be too bad. So we threw all caution to the wind as far as cost is concerned, and we handled gasoline. But believe me, we had some time, and some of the fantastic prices we paid and the hours we worked doing that is amazing. But I'll close the Great Lakes Pipeline Company with this incident. In the summer of 1948, we were winding up the thing. Our General Superintendent Alvin Carson took an airplane flight with Mr. and Mrs. Moreland from Alexandria, Minnesota to Grand Forks, North Dakota one afternoon. And later, Mr. Carson reported to me as they were flying along at about an altitude of 5,000 feet looking out over the beautiful woods and lakes of Minnesota. It was a beautiful summer day. Mrs. Moreland turned to her husband and says, honey, what do you suppose these flying saucers are anyway? And her very matter-of-fact husband says, why, darling, that's very simple. Those flying saucers are the 10 million bucks Great Lakes has sloughed off and can't account for. Have you had enough?
That's fine. We can go ahead.
Huh?
Go ahead. You're doing great.
You want me to keep on?
Yeah. You have it.
Oh, well, I could go on forever.
Go ahead. when we run this, we'll turn it over. This is
I attended the University of Missouri for 3 years, and in the winter of 1917-18, as soon as I reached 21, I filed an application for the Field Artillery Officers Training School at Camp Zachary Taylor, Kentucky. I was not called until after school was out, so I finished my junior year. Then I joined the Army and got my commission just about the time Germany surrendered and the war ended, so I never did get overseas. I came home and went to work for the Champ Refining Company. Worked out there 8 solid months, never missed a day for 8 months working, and most of it was on the afternoon shift or the graveyard shift. My father had told me that he had spent all the money he's going to spend on my education. If I went to school anymore, I was going to pay my own way. I succeeded in saving enough money working that 8 months to have easily paid my way through my senior year at the university. I was captain-elect of the University of Missouri football team. But when I got to Columbia in September 1919 to get the 30 hours I needed for a degree and to play my last year of football, I found out the girl I was supposed to be engaged in wasn't exactly conducting herself the way I thought an engaged girl should. Well, after a rather stormy week or so in Columbia, we ended up going to Kansas City and getting married, and I went home, went to work for my father in the construction business. But it's an odd thing that when the director of athletics at the University of Missouri heard that I was not going to enroll and play my last year of football, he got me in his office and he called me every name in the category. The idea that I was not going to finish my football and college career. But that was in 1919. Not he or anyone else even suggested I should marry the girl and stay in school. Yet 40 years later, our construction company went back and built 18 married students' dormitories on the campus of the University of Missouri, which is certainly an indication of how the viewpoint of the American people or somebody has changed. But I came home, went to work for my father, and then he said, "Well, now you've got a wife on your hands, no place to live, so I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll loan you and your brother Harry, who later on became quite a figure in the oil business, and he just then got out of the Army and entered the employment of H.A. Champlin in the oil business. I'll loan you two fellas the money to buy the old Eisenberg corner down here, and you can build yourself a 4-family apartment on that and have a place to live, and rent from the others will help pay me back." I built that 4-family apartment, moved into one apartment, rented the others at what I regard as very good rents, and since housing was pretty scarce in Enid as every place else at the close of World War I. And I looked at that project and I thought, "Oh, my land, this is a cinch. I'll just build a building every year, borrow the money, let the rent pay it off, and in 10 years I'll be able to retire." I started on a construction program. For 12 years, every year, we built a building that either I owned personally, our family owned, or an investment company we built, that we organized, owned. And the investment company was started in 1926 when an old University of Missouri fraternity brother of mine who had settled in Enid jumped in the car when I stopped at a stop line one day and with the statement, "Let's make some money." So we organized the Enid Bill Investment Company, and we bought 2 corner lots right north of the square in Enid. And then on one of them, we built and leased a building to the Parks to Neil Ford Agency. On the other one, we dreamed up the idea of building a hotel. But we spent a couple of years promoting the Youngblood Hotel, a 14-story building, which the people of Enid raised $150,000 in preferred stock, and Lawrence Youngblood, a young man who had made some money in the Seminole oil field, came up, and we built what was probably one of the finest hotels in the United States for a city that size in 1930. About the time we finished this hotel, there's a representative of Blackwell Oil and Gas Company walked in my office, and he told me that the company wanted to move their headquarters from Blackwell to Enid, but they could not find any office space in Enid anywhere. There just wasn't any available. As a result, they were going to have to move their office to Oklahoma City. That got us all pretty much excited, so we decided it was time somebody in Enid built an office building. So our Enid Bill Investment Company, which had done a very able job of promoting the Youngblood Hotel, decided to build the Bass Building, an 11-story office building. We started to work on that, and then the people on the other side of the square decided we were trying to move the town away from them. So they undertook the construction of the 14-story Youngblood Hotel. Both these buildings were opened right in the face of the Depression, and of course they were hopeless failures as far as financial ventures at that time. The Youngblood Hotel went through a receivership, and the Bass Building probably would have, except that the stockholders of the Enid Bill Investment Company had endorsed the first mortgage on it to the Commerce Trust Company of Kansas City, and Mr. Jim Kemper, the president of the Commerce Trust Company, who saw to it that we fulfill our obligations and paid them off. So the Bass Building has been in the ownership of the corporation, has been paid for out years, and has been a fairly successful project. But that made 12 buildings, 12 years in succession that I built a building for investment of some kind. And of course, the Depression came on, and of course, all the mortgage and everything uh, caught me, so that for several years I was not in position to build anything in a way of investment building. But now that after about 10 years of hard work, we got all our debts paid, so we started in again, and I am now more active in the real estate construction business in Enid than I've ever been. As a matter of fact, at this moment, I'm involved in 9 different real estate developments in Enid, which is an awful lot for a community no bigger. But the nice thing about it is they all seem to be working out, and the reason they're working out is because Enid, Oklahoma is probably the most substantial community of 45,000 people in the United States. And I think I could substantiate that. We have got enough varied industry and varied payrolls and various economic assets that I doubt if there's a community anywhere. And I might do a little boasting about Enid by reciting an episode that occurred a few months ago. A major out at the Advanced Air Base who suffers from a historical complex such as I do called me one morning and says, we have got a friend of ours from Lubbock, Texas, spend the weekend with us. And this gentleman's in the real estate business. He has never been to Enid before, and he'd like to have a look at this town. If I brought him by, would you take us on a ride around Enid? Well, I said, I'd be tickled to death to. So these 2 gentlemen came by. The Texan got up in the front seat with me. The major climbed in the back seat, and we started out. And this boy from Lubbock started the conversation by saying, in one sector in Lubbock, Texas, there are 600 vacant, foreclosed FHA houses. And that's not all the foreclosed houses in Lubbock. That's just one sector. I said, for the love of Mike, I can't understand that. I said, I believe I can safely say that in Enid, Oklahoma, there's not a single home foreclosure of any nature underway. The major in the back seat spoke up and says, well, of course there's not. Says, don't you know the reputation Enid enjoys out at Advance? And I says, what's that? He says, out at Advance, they tell me that Enid, Oklahoma has more millionaires per capita than any city in the world. You've got 40,000 people and 40 millionaires. And a year or 2 before that, I'd got some information from the Cadillac Company, which would indicate that Enid has more Cadillacs per capita than any city in the world, which would make the major statement more or less correct. But at least there's enough wealth in Enid drawn from mainly from agriculture, but also by a very active and long drawn out, and apparently will be a long drawn out oil development, which gives us an economy, I would say, almost equal to none. For instance, in the population count this year shows that Muskogee, Oklahoma, Hudson, Kansas, Salina, Kansas, Joplin, Missouri, all towns of approximately similar population, lost population in the last 10 years, and Enid gained 7,000 people, with gaining practically no new industry of any kind from outside. It's just being built by the work of the people in Enid.
You were born in 1897, so you began to recall things at Enid, I guess, at about 1903 or 4. Why don't you describe Enid as it was when you first remember it?
Well, I'll do that. I might say that, of course, my older brother says I imagined it, but my first recollection is I walked out on the back porch, and my older brother Harry, 2 years older than I, was sitting on the back steps crying. I asked him why he was crying, and he said the president had just died. William McKinley had just died. Well, at 4 years of age, the death of the president meant nothing to me, and I laughed. So my older brother jumped up and gave me a good punching because I laughed at the president died. Now I can see that just as distinct today. I can even see the washing machine on the back porch where that guy was beating me up for laughing at the death of the president. So so my memory can go back that far. But I can remember the days when we had no telephones, no sewage disposal plant of any kind, no running water, no paving, no streetcars, and I can remember very well when the first telephone came in. I can remember when we got a inside bathroom because the sewer had come along. We could hook up a bathroom. I can remember when we had the first running water, and I can remember when the Warner Quinlan Company came out from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and laid the first paving around the square in Enid. I can remember when when the streetcars were built, and an interesting angle of that is that an Ohio company put the streetcar system in Enid and Tulsa. A fellow named Clarence Klein was set out to operate both installations, and he was instructed to make his home in the biggest of the two cities. He moved to Enid. Enid at 1909 was bigger than Tulsa, and until after World War I, Clarence Klein ran the Tulsa streetcar system from Enid. At that time, of course, Tulsa had grown so tremendously, he had to move to Tulsa to look after it.
Did you, without roads or without paved streets, were there many water problems there as far as?
Oh yes, every time it rained, of course, we just the streets were mud holes. That's all. Oh, we had plenty of, and of course, the town was so new without any pavement, there had been no pretense of graveling any streets. Now I can remember the streets around the square of Enid, Oklahoma, where all the shopping was at that time. Every time it rained, it was just a loblolly of mud.
Did you ever have? I know in Seminole, looking at some of the album pictures of horses getting caught in the mud. Did you ever have a situation?
Oh yeah, indeed, I saw that too. You bet your life. Well, I can't remember. I saw them in Enid, but I'll tell you where I did see it was, of course, this is much later. I was in the old Tonka oil field in the early 1920s. We did a lot of work in K County during the boom period of the Burbank field in the Osage and the Tonka oil field. At that time, they were still using oxen. I saw a wagon load of pipe bogged down with 16 oxen trying to pull it out in the early 1920s. And my land, the miles of bogged down horses and mules and wagons, the trucks were practically unknown in 1922.
Did you have many electric cars in Enid?
Well, I heard that discussed just recently. Some lady tried to tell me there was only one electric car in Enid. Well, I said I can remember 3 electric cars, and there was probably a few more than that. We never did have very many electric cars. I do remember very distinctly the first automobile in Enid. A gentleman named Sherman Goltry bought it, and I never will forget that someone yelled, "Here comes the automobile," and we all ran up the corner to see Enid's first automobile go by.
Who was Sherman Goltry?
Well, Sherman Goltry was a gentleman came down with his younger brother Charlie Goltry in about 1900 and purchased the First National Bank from H.H. Champlin. And they ran that bank for several years, and then they sold it back to Mr. Champlin. Mr. Champlin had gotten to the lumber business, had several yards over western and southwestern Oklahoma, and he got out of the banking business, but then re-entered it. And his family still owns the controlling stock in the First National Bank of Enid, a very fine institution.
What happened to the Goltry family?
Well, this is kind of interesting. Sherman Goltry passed away, but Charlie Goltry traded his home in Enid for a farm in K County. He traded his home for the farm to W.B. Johnson, and the W.B. Johnson Grain and Seed Company now is the biggest independent wheat operators in Oklahoma, and also the biggest seed business. Dale Johnson, W.B.'s sons, run it now, and it's a very fine, well-established business. In fact, a pretty big business. But Charlie Goltry ended up with this quarter section over in K County, and it became one of the most lucrative producers in the Tonka oil field. Mr. Goltry took in a great deal of money. Well, we built, in our building spurge, we borrowed the money from Mr. Goltry to build 2 4-family apartments. My father borrowed some money from him, but by 1929, we had paid Mr. Goltry all the money we owed him. But one day I got an opportunity to buy a lot and lease a building, which sounded like a good business deal to me. So I went to Mr. Goltry's office and told him that I wanted to borrow about $20,000 to buy this lot and build this building. Mr. Goltry said, "Well, you know, if I were going to make any more investments in Enid, I'd rather loan the money to you than anybody I know of, because my deal with you and your father have been very satisfactory. But," he says, "Enid has no future. I am making no more investments in Enid. I'm going to collect every mortgage I have outstanding around Enid, and I'm going to put all my money from now on into 7% Chicago apartment house bonds. He did just that and lost practically his whole fortune.
Who were the leaders in Enid at the time you first recall, very early 19th century?
Well, of course, O.J. Fleming was the original banker, and he was just about over the 30 years until he died about 1931. He was probably the leading citizen in Enid most of that time. H.H. Champlin came on, especially after he bought his bank back along about 1908 and became very prominent and became our most outstanding citizen, our wealthiest citizen. I might relate the details of his getting the oil business. He had his bank on the west side of Enid. It had a two-step up into the entrance, and every pretty afternoon he would sit in the shade and on those steps and just talk to the townspeople as they went by. Well, in 1916, the Sinclair Oil Company, Harry Sinclair, he didn't have an oil company then, but the Sinclair Oil Company got started in Garfield County in the Old Garber oil field. That's the first really lucrative production Harry Sinclair ever made. But somewhere along the line, his men forgot to pay the lease rental on a quarter section over there on the Beggs farm. And Mr. Beggs discovered that he had a farm not leased. He didn't know what to do with it, so he meandered into Enid, looking for somebody to buy the lease on his farm. Well, he ran across a realtor named John Lee, and John Lee began looking for somebody to peddle that lease to, and he walked down the street this summer afternoon and encountered Mr. Champlin sitting on the steps. He sold that lease to H.H. Champlin for $11,500. That put Mr. Champlin into the oil business. The Beggs lease turned out to be a most lucrative producer, and Mr. Champlin went on from there to build the Champlin Refining Company, which at the time his heirs sold it. The Chicago Corporation was the biggest independent, fully integrated oil company in existence. A family-owned, individually owned oil company. And so Mr. Champlin became a man of tremendous wealth, and the family still has that wealth, although they're no longer in the Champlin Petroleum Company at all.
Can you think of any other particular leaders during that early period?
Well, I can remember we had a gentleman named John Murphy. When I was just a little kid, we were running down the street one day, and some boy pointed out the house where Colonel John Murphy lived. He said, "There's the richest man in town. He's worth $50,000." And Mr. Murphy was an early day banker and a very active man in real estate around here, a very successful man. But his heirs soon spent everything he left them. None of them turned out to be much good in business. And
Any other individuals you can think of?
of course, our ex-governor, Frank France, settled in Enid for a while until he...
Can you talk about him?
Sir?
Can you talk about him?
Oh, well, I can talk about Frank France at considerable length. Frank France was living in Prescott, in Arizona. His brothers, I believe 3 brothers, had settled in Enid, but for some other reason or other, Frank left Enid, wandered out to Prescott, Arizona, and was living there when the Spanish-American War started. Well, he enlisted in Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders and went to Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt. So when the war was ended, instead of going back to Arizona, Frank came back to Enid. He was living in Enid when Teddy Roosevelt became president, and there was some sort of some sort of a scandal in the territorial governor's office. And anyway, the governor resigned very suddenly, was removed, and Teddy Roosevelt appointed his old Rough Rider, Frank France, governor of Oklahoma, and Frank France was governor when statehood came in. And then he left Enid when shortly after he came back from the governorship and settled in Tulsa and lived there until he passed away.
Did he succeed Jenkins?
I kind of think it was, but I'm not quite sure. But anyway, Frank was the last territorial governor.
others, and there have been a number. This switches to a little bit of different side. But a number of Enid people have become prominent in different other areas away from Enid. You want to talk about any of them?
Well, yes, we have had quite a few people. Now, Frank France had three brothers, all who did pretty well in Enid. One of them, Edmund, of course, as I mentioned earlier, it was very instrumental in building the Frisco and Santa Fe railroads. That's part of it. And then Will France was in the lumber business, and his son Harry France is now a very prominent insurance man in Enid, with two sons who are carrying on in great fashion. Then Mont France was in the hardware business. Then we had another France, Walter France, went to Harvard from Enid. I'll always remember as a kid, everybody spoke in awe that Walter France went to Harvard University. And that, as far as we knew, nobody else around Enid ever gone to any university. And but now there's one character I am going to talk about a little bit that I think he passed away in Washington within the last 3 months. A fellow named Victor Messel. Victor's grandfather, with Victor's father, who was about 20 years old, made the run, came into Enid, and started a bottling company. As I recall, they also had a saloon on the side. And I might be a little mixed up on my history, but when the Oklahoma statehood came in, of course, we had our prohibition law, and all the saloons in Enid were closed up. At that time, the Messel family, Rick Messel, with his son and daughter, moved back to Joplin, Missouri. And Vic Messel took up with a fellow there named Lee, who operated a weekly newspaper. Lee was elected to the Missouri legislature, and Vic Messel went back to Jefferson City with Lee and got a job where Mr. Lee got him a job as a page boy. Then sometime later, Vic came back to Enid, and this fellow Lee was very politically ambitious. So, of course, the Joplin, Missouri area is more or less a Republican area. There was a fellow named Dewey Short represented that Joplin area for many years in Congress. Every 2 years, this fellow Lee would run against Dewey Short for Congress, was always defeated. Well, every 2 years, Vic would go back and help his pal in the campaign. Well, in 1932, Mr. Lee ran against Dewey Short again, but Vic didn't. At that time, was absolutely flat broke, just running a little filling station in, and he didn't have enough money to go back to Joplin to help his father, help his pal. But in the Roosevelt landslide, Lee defeated Dewey Short for the Congress. The night of the election, as soon as he discovered he was elected, Mr. Lee called Vic up and said, "Vic, I've just been elected to Congress, and I want you to go back to Washington with me and be my secretary." Of course, that was just wonderful, because Vic was just on the ragged edge. Well, Vic, I can't remember how much of an education Vic Messel had, but I'm sure he never went through high school. But he goes back to Washington. He had a wonderful give-out personality, and he was as bright as the Dickens. So in a couple of 2 years, he learned a lot about the ropes around Washington. Well, in 1934, I was in Kansas City. We were doing some work for the Great Lakes Pipeline Company, and Tom Pendergast was at the height of his glory. He had a hand-picked senatorial candidate campaigning in the primary. No, in the general election it was. And it was essentially he's going to be elected, because at that time Pendergast was counting enough votes to elect anybody governor or senator as he wanted. Well, one morning Tom Pendergast received a telegram. His candidate, while making a political talk in southeast Missouri, had dropped dead on the platform, and Mr. Pendergast needed a senatorial campaign quick. At that time, Harry Truman, I'd had a little bit of experience with Harry Truman mixed up in fact, we had a terrifically rough time with the Kansas City labor unions during the years we worked there. But anyway, I'd had just a little bit of truck with Mr. Truman then, and I remember Mr. Truman told me that the Kansas City Union boys wouldn't act like we were trying to tell him they had acted. We'd gone to him with the hopes that we'd get some sort of protection from him. Anyway, Mr. Truman had become a little bit unhappy with his job as being a county judge. In Oklahoma, we call them commissioners. So he decided to go down to see the boss and tell him he wanted a better job. He walks into Tom Pendergast's office just at the moment that Tom Pendergast gets this wire that his senatorial candidate had dropped dead and he needed a new candidate. Truman walks in, Tom Pendergast with a telegram in his hand looks up and says, "Good morning, Mr. Senator." Harry Truman was elected in the fall of 34, was elected as senator from Missouri. Well, in the same election, Vic Messel's boss, Mr. Lee, was defeated for Congress. Louis Short was reelected, leaving Vic stranded in Washington with no money and right in the midst of the Depression. So Vic got on a train, went out to Independence, Missouri, and introduced himself to Harry Truman and told him that about his experience in Washington. He knew all the ropes and everything. He wanted to be Mr. Truman's secretary. And Truman has always said, Tom Pendergast already hired some fellow to be my secretary. So Vic goes down to Kansas City, interviews Mr. Pendergast, and told him of his experience and everything. And Vic did have a salesman personality. So he convinced that Tom Pendergast that Mr. Truman and his prospective secretary had never been to Washington at all, knew nothing about it, and they needed somebody to sort of show them the ropes. So Tom Pendergast hired Vic for on a basis of 90 days of showing the new senator the way around and his secretary the way around Washington. At the end of 90 days, Truman liked Vic so much more than he did the other one, his secretary, that he got his secretary another job and made Vic Messel his secretary. Well, Vic served as secretary for a little over 6 years. And 3 or 4 times I met Vic and Mr. Truman in Enid. I remember one night in the Youngblood Hotel, Harry Truman told a group of us he just loved to come to Enid where he'd get away from it all. And I remember another session, we were talking about of course, we were in a conservative Republican territory in Enid, and we were sort of criticizing Mr. Truman for the socialistic trend going on in Washington. And Mr. Truman says, "I wish some of you would come back in Washington and talk like that. We never hear your viewpoint ever expressed to anybody. All we hear is the public wants all these new laws and these new socialistic schemes and everything." And of course, Truman, he was a politician first noise, and he didn't care what he voted for, just so he could stay in office. Well, in the summer of 1940, when the time came for Truman to run for the renomination, his pal Tom Pendergast was sent to penitentiary. And of course, the Pendergast fortune was such a low ebb that Truman knew he had no chance in the world of being renominated, and he decided not to run again because the governor of the governor of Missouri, who was responsible for sending Tom Pendergast to penitentiary, and the United States attorney, a fellow named Pat Milligan, both of them decided to run for the United States Senate. And Truman knew that he was in such low repute that he didn't have a chance in the world of being elected. So he decided not to run. Well, this fellow Messel just deliberately went out to Missouri and filed his name anyway. Put up the $150 file. And Truman never even had $150 to file with, he claimed. But Truman filed Vic filed Mr. Truman's name, and then it opened up his headquarters, Sedalia. When they counted the votes, Truman had 34% of the vote, Milligan had 33%, and Stark had 33%. And Mr. Truman went back into office. Am I talking too much? No. I'll finish messing it. Well, all right. So anyway, right after the election, I went back to do Washington business, and I was sitting on Sunday afternoon in front of the fireplace in Vic Messel's house, and he told me detail for detail just how Truman was renominated, reelected. And I've got 2 books written by people who also substantiate everything this Messel said. If it wasn't Vic Messel, Truman wouldn't have ever been reelected. Well, by the time with Truman being reelected, on Roosevelt's coattails, Vic decided that he could make more money being a 5%er instead of a senatorial secretary. So he resigned and did make a lot of money around Washington. And I remember on one visit to him there, I said, "Vic, for heaven's sake, now you have starved off and on all your life. Now you're really making some money. I want you to start putting this money in Garfield County, Oklahoma wheat farm, so you'll have something in your old age." Oh, of course, he'd left Oklahoma behind. He was making so much more money than he'd ever heard of that he didn't have any time for Oklahoma investments, even though the wife still has some property up there. But somewhere along the line, one of Vic's men, employees, fell out with him, and he sued Vic Missel for $35,000. And Vic's wife went to the trial, and the plaintiff's attorney kept trying to draw out of Vic what he did for a living. He never could get anywhere with it all. So finally, the judge took up the question, and he never could get out of Vic just what he did for a living. And finally, when the court adjourned for a recess, Mrs. Messel walked out, and a newspaper reporter met her on the outside of the courtroom and said to Mrs. Messel, said, "We listened to all that questioning." Says, "Just what does your husband do for a living?" And Mrs. Messel says, "Well, I don't know what he does, but whatever it is, it's awful good." Well, in 1944, my son had gotten a ROTC commission in artillery at Fort Sill, and then he had applied for a transfer to engineers. He was sent to the engineers school at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and he got a graduated there in February in 1944. And my wife and I went back at the time he graduated, and we had taken up, we'd become very friendly with the chief of Army Engineers, a fellow named Colonel Henry Montgomery. He had charge of the Tulsa office while we were doing all our war work. He had become chief of engineers, and so we go back to Washington. We invite Henry Montgomery to come down and have dinner with us, and we had invited Vic and his wife to come down, and our son came in from Fort Belvoir, and Vic and I were sitting in the middle of a round booth there in the Statler Hotel, and Bob, my son, was talking to his boss, the colonel, and my wife and Mrs. Henry were talking, so that left Vic and me free in the middle of the booth. And Vic turned to me and said, "You know who's going to be vice president of Roosevelt this year?" I said, "Well, I haven't any idea." He says, "Looks like it's going to be my old boss." I said, "You mean Truman?" "That's right," he said. "Harry Truman, you watch what's happening. Harry Truman's going to be the vice presidential nominee." And that was in February '44, and nobody knew that at that moment except this guy Messel. And there's a man who I don't suppose there's one thing written anywhere except those a couple of passages in 2 books about Victor Messel, but he had a most interesting life.
Any other Enid people? I mean, you've mentioned a number of them, you know, and some you recommended I interviewed. Do you want to talk about any of those?
Let's see, I can't remember now who all.
Let's see. Well, one of them, of course, was Margaret Simon, and was one of them. There was another one in Washington that you mentioned in this last letter. I don't remember.
Oh, did I mention old Senator Birch By's wife?
Yes.
Oh, she's a honey. You know, this little girl, while she was in high school, went off to.
Identify her name.
Her name was. She's Mrs. Birch By, but her maiden name is Marvella Hearn. She went off to National Oratorical Contest in the senior year of her high school, and she competes against Birch By. She won number 1 point, and Birch By was number 2, and they fell in love with each other and were married. So, of course, Birch By is from Indiana. They settled in Indiana, and he's still just a youngster. But he ran against the Senate 6 years ago, 8 years ago, I guess it is now, against Senator Capehart, and the court of the Chicago Tribune. She elected him because this little wife of Birch By didn't campaign with him. She campaigned for herself, traveling and making talks with it. And it was one of the most shocking elections in the history of Indiana. That young Birch By would defeat a veteran like Capehart. But 2 years ago, he was reelected. And she is the cutest, one of the cutest looking girls I ever saw in my life. And boy, has she got personality. Now, I'll tell you, a character we had born in Enid was Sherman Billingsley, the fellow that ran the Stork Club. You interviewed his sister-in-law.